Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Dhvani Mehta, one of the co-founders of the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, and I'm delighted that we have such a fantastic panel with us to discuss what I think is one of the most important policy and public health issues of our time, reforming the regulation of pharmaceuticals and medical devices in India. Now, the pandemic has brought much needed attention to the manner in which drugs and vaccines are approved, bringing questions about safety and efficacy into the public discourse like never before. And with the government of India having announced its intention to reform the 80-year-old Drugs and Cosmetics Act, I think there's a real opportunity for us to have a constructive debate about the challenges with medical products regulation and the kinds of changes that are needed. So we're really lucky that we have a set of panelists who've been working indefatigably on these issues and are genuinely committed to seeing real change. I'd like to begin by introducing Katherine Eban, who's an investigative journalist who writes on questions of public health and whose book, A Bottle of Lies, exposed some really troubling truths about the generic drugs industry. We also have Dinesh Thakur, whose story as whistleblower against Ranbaxy Laboratories forms the backbone of Katherine's book, and who's now using his extensive experience in the pharmaceutical sector to advocate on public health issues and persistently pursue drug regulatory reform in India. It's also then fitting that we have Mr. K.L. Sharma, who was former Joint Secretary of Drug and Food Regulation in the Government of India, and who's written an invaluable book on medical device and medical product regulation in India called Healing the Pharmacy of the World. So Katherine, in her book, A Bottle of Lies, ends by writing about the email that Dinesh sent Mr. Sharma seeking an appointment with him because of their shared sense of right and wrong when it came to public health. So it's great that all three of them are sharing this platform today and are joined by someone else who is also equally committed to public health. So we have Priyanka Pulla, our fourth panelist, who's a health and science journalist and who's done some fantastic reporting on drug regulatory problems and their impact on human health, especially during the course of the pandemic. So thank you very much to all of you for being with us, being here with us today. For the audience, we're going to structure this discussion with some opening remarks from the panelists, which will then flow into an open discussion. And then we will end that with questions from the audience. So if you have any questions that you'd like to put to us, please post them in the Q&A box during the course of the discussion. Great. I think if I may, Katherine, I'll start with you. And just the investigative work that you've done has sort of shown us how deceptive practices within the pharmaceutical industry spilled through the cracks of even as powerful an agency as the FDA. Now, the Indian government in the latest round of reforms that it's announced is contemplating a switch to a one-point agency along the styles of the FDA. So what would you sort of say are some of the pitfalls that we should watch out for when attempting to replicate a similar regulatory style? Can something like this be replicated in the Indian context? I mean, actually, I'll let some of the other panelists respond to that. But yeah, I wanted to hear from you whether what you think about some of the weaknesses of the US system, and also how much you think we can really control through regulation, and what are the limits that a regulatory agency can achieve?
Well, first of all, good morning from New York. Very nice to be on this panel and to be with all the participants. Thank you for joining us. So first, let me say, I expose really dismaying fraud in the generic drug industry and Bottle of Lies. Much of it is focused on India, which is not to say, of course, that there is no fraud in the US. There's plenty of fraud here. And our regulator, the US FDA, is far from perfect. And in fact, I expose many of the agency's shortcomings in Bottle of Lies. But I will say one thing about the US FDA, which is it, despite all its shortcomings, it is feared by the companies in the US. The inspections that take place that the FDA conducts really matter. Their findings really matter. And companies really sort of arrange how they operate around trying to meet FDA regulations. And though, of course, in a perfect world, we would all like to be able to rely on corporations to do the right thing, whether anybody is watching or not. That is just not reality on planet Earth. You know, companies, by and large, no matter where they are located, will do what they can get away with. And I do think that companies that are based in the US that have sort of grown up in a highly regulated environment do tend to kind of integrate compliance into their daily operations. So that is absolutely what you need when you think about what you want from a regulator. You need to think about a regulator who is going to sort of turn on the Klieg lights on an industry and really enforce the best possible behavior. So I think, you know, as we talk about reform in India, we have to put transparency at the center. You know, transparency absolutely has to be at the center of any regulatory overhaul, whether that's, you know, that's transparency in how the companies operate, and also transparency in how the regulators operate, not to mention which, you know, transparency that journalists, and India has some of the finest, transparency that journalists can bring to what's going on the ground. So I think, you know, let me just sort of leave it there for the moment, but that is how I would think of it, just to structure an opening remark.
Great. Thanks very much, Katherine. I think what you've said points to, I mean, you know, apart from having a regulator that is well-staffed and well-funded, it also points to the need to change the regulatory culture or the environment in which, you know, pharmaceutical companies operate. So that brings me to you, Mr. Sharma, and you've obviously, you know, given a lot of thought to what are some of the concrete things that need to change as far as Indian medical products regulation goes. Now, what do we need? As you know, as Katherine said, what do we need to create a regulator that companies, fear in some sense, I suppose, but also one that is able to instill that culture of compliance in them? So how do we get there? And is that a goal that we should be looking to achieve as well?
Thank you, Dhvani, very much, and thank you for organizing it. Good evening to everybody in India, and good evening to you in USA. So first of all, I think what I must state categorically upfront is that there is a need for India to augment its regulation in order to improve the quality, solely because India is one of the largest suppliers of the generic drugs to almost all the countries over the globe. Now, there are a number of bottlenecks and there are reasons for that. And I have elaborated those reasons in my book. And unless we look at those reasons, we will not be in a position to identify the solution. So finding the causes first is very important. So the first and foremost thing that I see problematic is the placement of the drugs in the concurrent list. So the consequence of that is that we have 37 regulators regulating the medical products in India, which is actually working at cross purposes, and it doesn't give the required results. So sometimes political expediency is also used by the politicians for converting the regulatory structures to give up some of the compliances, and some of the compromises are made at that level also. That is one of the important things. Industry, there is a competition between the states. This is what I have been highlighting for locating the industry, because that helps in generating the employment. It raises the GDP of the state and things like that. But despite the constitutional restrictions, it should have been possible for the government at the center to usher in a lot of regulatory and legislative reforms. But that has not happened, and that has not happened solely for the reason that the political executive in India is more engaged in the political activities, and the reason for that is the elections happening to the state legislative assembly or the parliament. Every 6 months there will be some election or the other, and they concentrate their energies on electoral battles. So very less time is spent by the political executive on the core issue of policy formulation, and that impacts the regulation of medical products in India also. As far as the senior echelons of the bureaucracy are concerned, I think I'm not very, despite being in the system for so long, I'm not very convinced that they are concerned with the outputs and they are concerned with delivering. And what is actually problematic also is that over a very short span of period, they move from one organization to another, so that institutional memory doesn't get built up. And as a result of that, there is also no accountability. They are not responsible for the outcomes. So that kind of things are there. But what is important is that whatever has happened. India is now in a position to usher in a lot of reforms, and a lot of changes should happen, because we have to provide, and we have in fact an obligation as a country with a demographic dividend and so-called scientific and engineering prowess. We have an obligation to the world to provide medical products of good quality and actually become a global hub for medical facilities for the world as a whole. So that having been said, there is a need for looking at those issues, and there is a need for clarity of vision at the political and the senior levels of the bureaucratic structures. We cannot have a system where every regulator, at the state level and the central level, they are interpreting the law in the manner in which it is being interpreted by them, with a view to improve the local employment generation or things like that. There is another major problem, and that problem is that lawmaking is not an easy job, especially in a complex field, in a dynamic field where newer products are coming in. It's no longer the pharmaceuticals alone, it's not the chemicals alone. There are biologics, there are high-tech medic equipment, there are things that are also like your combination products are there, which include biologics, chemicals, and medtech all together. So in order to ensure that we do justice to the quality of the product, it is important that we diversify the human resources, we take the talented manpower in the respective areas, and we have separate verticals for dealing with all these different areas. Both at the center and the states, the political expediency and the bureaucratic inefficiencies have to be given up, and there has to be a convergence. And I would personally feel that it would be better if we could have one nation, one law, and one regulator for all medical products with required specializations. I think with that, I'll stop here, and then we'll discuss as the discussion goes on. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Mr. Sharma. That's a great starting jumping off point. And you've highlighted two of the key issues with this sector. One is this sort of center state tension, and the other is the lack of political will to bring about change. And that's where I'd like to bring in Mr. Thakur, who's been working on these issues tirelessly over the last several years, and maybe get his thoughts on what is it that's what he sees as the role of public health advocacy in moving the needle on this issue. Where do we find, how do we get, how do we make some of these issues electoral issues, as Mr. Sharma was talking about? How do we communicate that safe and I mean, unsafe and poor quality drugs have an actual impact on human lives? And where do we find the impetus to bring about the kind of legal and regulatory change that's needed? And yeah, generally, what you see as the role of public health advocacy in this regard.
Thanks, Dhvani. Good evening to everybody in India. I truly appreciate Katherine joining us and Mr. Sharma joining us and Priyanka for this important discussion. But before I answer the question you're asking me, Dhvani, about the role of the advocacy process within what is really happening, let me just take a step back and articulate three things that I've learned since 2013, right? When sort of the case became public, Katherine wrote about it. And then, we went to the Supreme Court with the public interest litigation, but the Supreme Court decided not to hear for whatever reason. And then we've been continuing to work. Prashant Reddy, who works with me and I, we've been working on this area for quite some time right now, trying to highlight issues. So before I get to those two issues, just give me a couple of minutes, because this is going to take a little bit of time. So just give me a few minutes. It's refreshing to actually have a bureaucrat like Mr. Sharma actually talking honestly about what ails us. It's very difficult to find even former bureaucrats engaging with public, right? So this is a part of public advocacy. It's a part of what the conversation that we need to have as a country, right? People like Mr. Sharma actually know how the sausage is made behind the scenes, and it's important to have that perspective out in the public, engaged with key stakeholders. That doesn't happen often enough in India. I see it happening here in the United States. So it's very important to have a voice like that participate in the public process. And so thank you, Mr. Sharma, for doing that. I have to tell you that Katherine and I haven't spoken recently, because she's got a really busy schedule and haven't been able to talk to her in person. But two of the points that she made really resonated with me. So we didn't compare notes and prepare for this discussion. The one thing she said was that, yes, there's a level of fear among the pharma industry in the United States because the US FDA is a strict regulator. It demands compliance. I have to say that there's also fear of the Indian industry, of the CDSCO in the Indian industry, but for all the wrong reasons. It is a fear because they don't understand what they're doing. There's a lack of competence, which Mr. Sharma highlighted. There is inbuilt corruption, in the process, right? So the fear exists, but for all the wrong reasons. And so with that background, let me just point out three specific things that are really important, given that now at least we're holding a conversation about rewriting the colonial era Drugs and Cosmetics Act. It's 1940, right? Before even we became independent. The first thing is the disproportionate role of the industry in the lawmaking process. It's really important to acknowledge this. I'll give you a specific example of why, how this actually transpires. In the 1970s, the Hathi Committee report pointed out that we need to demonstrate clinical equivalency of our drugs, generic drugs, to the innovator product. This is 1970s, and Hathi Committee, a very reputable report that was written. We've essentially put that idea on the shelf for 30 years before the Marshalkar Committee report again looked at the industry and said, what do we do to rejuvenate our pharmaceutical industry in 2003, right? Do you know that the Marshalkar Committee report actually doesn't even talk about equivalence of generic drugs? Question is why, right? Marshalkar Committee report is held up as one of the great examples of the kind of work that needs to be done to help advance the industry and the industry's strength, in India, and also because we're such a global supplier. There is really nothing in the Marshalkar Committee report that talks about, how do we clinically prove that our generic formulations are equivalent to the innovative formulation. The next part of this actually comes in 2013 after the Parliamentary Standing Committee report, the Rajya Sabha Parliamentary Committee report excoriated the CDSCO and the drug laws, right? Subsequent to that, they basically, at that point in time, basically the DTAB, which is the Drug Technical Advisory Board, which has representation of the industry on that board, right? They basically looked at that and said, don't worry, we're not going to look at this, because you know why? And it's written in the minutes of the drugs DTAB that we're not going to look at equivalence of generic drugs for the country because it's going to be it's going to be really expensive for us to be able to implement it, right? So until Mr. Sharma came around in 2017, amended the rules and made it mandatory, looked at the BCS classification system, 1970s in Hathi Committee report to 2017 when Mr. Sharma amended the rules and brought in the BCS system. Look how long it took. And the reason is very simple. We have representation of the industry on the lawmaking body, DTAB, right? World over, when you make laws, you solicit input from the industry. You ask them to provide input. You don't give them decision-making powers. That's what we do. Our entire focus is ease of doing business. We don't look at this as a public health issue. Drugs and Cosmetics Act is a public health issue. The role of the regulator, the CDSU, is a public health issue. It is not an ease of doing business. We are looking at this the wrong way. We are looking at this from the point of view of ease of doing business, and that has to change. If you put vested parties with conflicts of interest on your decision making for making law, what are you going to get?
Absolutely.
Right?
No, absolutely.
And the second point I want to talk about is transparency. Right? Katherine pointed out, the need for transparency. The reason why the US FDA is so much accountable to the people is because it's transparent. I'll give you an example, how long it took Malini Aisola and Siddharth to get the membership of the subject expert committee that approved our vaccine candidates in December. We won't even know who the people were who actually recommended that the vaccine candidate be approved. Why is that a state secret? Transparency has to be the centerpiece, as Katherine said, of any regulation that we make, because that is the only way we are going to make this thing accountable to the people of India.
Absolutely.
So these are things that we really have to think about, right? So the conflicts of interest of the industry, how they participate in the lawmaking process has to be addressed. They should not have a role in framing the law. They should certainly have a role in giving input to the lawmakers to say, these are the issues you really have to address. There is absolutely a role. I mean, in 2013, when we framed rules for biosimilars, it was driven by Biocon and Roche. They wrote the rules. Is that what you want? I mean, these are things that we really have to think about, right? I think that even well-meaning bureaucrats in the government gets their hands tied up because this is the kind of nonsense that happens. The DTAB has representatives of the state drug regulators. Mr. Sharma talked about 37. You get 37 people in the room and try and make a decision. And 37 individual interests. And then you add on top of that the industry's interest in it. What kind of rules are we going to get? It's very rare that we'll have a bureaucrat as Mr. Sharma who says, you know what, I'm going to do this, I'm going to amend the rules. Even today, they're not implemented, the 2017 rules. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, look, we have to think about transparency, number one. Role of the industry and conflict of interest is the second one.
Right.
And the third thing is we have to really think about how we frame our laws. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity, right? This is a colonial era law that we're going to be rewriting. I just hope, I'm really, really hoping that once the bill is introduced, it goes to the Parliamentary Standing Committee. It doesn't get passed by a voice vote in the Parliament, because that's what we're seeing right now. I want a proper deliberation of this at the Parliamentary Standing Committee. Let them talk to every stakeholder that there is. Let them bring the industry in. Let them hold open hearings. Let them have a good, measured, deliberated law passed in Parliament. I just hope that we don't go down the way that we have done. We've been seeing in the Parliament recently where, we introduce a law in the past, pass it by voice vote, because it's too important, I mean, look, in the last 6 months, there have been so many leaks about what this committee that the government has formed is doing, right? They've been inviting people by invitation, specifically industry, to consult. I don't see any invitation going out to activists and people who work in the public health area. This is not how you do it, right? Send it to the Parliamentary Standing Committee, let them debate it, let them look at it from, holistically, and then decide, what is it that they want to do with it, right? So these are certain things that I think that are really important. Now, the point that you asked me, I'm sorry, I'm taking a little long right now for my opening comments, but I think that there is a role of public health advocacy in this space, right? Unfortunately, in India, most of the advocacy has been on price, and for good reason. Drugs are really expensive. Good drugs are really expensive, and there's a lot of advocacy in the price space. There isn't enough advocacy in the quality space. I lament that. I'm trying to sort of do my little bit in this space, but I think that there is a role for advocacy, because without advocacy, we wouldn't be here today. Without advocacy, the government wouldn't even be thinking about. Without Priyanka Pulla writing about how opaque the process is, about the way that we are approving our drugs, the role of all of these stakeholders who have conflicts of interest. They won't even make conversation about rewriting the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, right? So there needs to be more advocacy on the quality front. So with that, I'll stop. I'm sorry I'm taking a little bit longer, but I think this is really important for us to be able to sort of talk about it holistically. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thanks very much, Dinesh. And that was a very important perspective that you brought in, as in, making us think more deeply about how we frame our laws. And I think that's a good, entry for Priyanka as well. So, Priyanka, what is it that, as Dinesh pointed out, we need to do something to change the public narrative around this. We need to get people more invested in issues of, both drug pricing and drug quality, and to see this as a right to health issue. So what is it that you think, how do we ensure that we bring questions like this into the public consciousness and sort of generate the political impetus for legal and regulatory change?
Right. So I was sort of thinking about this since yesterday, and I think I want to sort of bring in the journalistic point of view about the kind of narrative that journalists have been exposed to when it comes to drug quality with time. Basically, if somebody were to ask you whether India has differing quality standards compared to, say, more stringently regulated countries like the US or Europe, the answer would be yes, right? At various points in history, we have taken explicit, deliberate decisions to either adopt different and slightly more lenient quality standards, or to implement them slightly differently, with the explicit aim to improve access to medicine and to encourage the industry. Okay, and I think this is not something that's up for debate, because it's fairly well documented. If you go back and look at the various minutes of meeting of drugs consultative committees, etc., it's fairly apparent that this is a call we've made. And yet, this particular this fact is not acknowledged in public discussions, and most laypersons do not know this. Okay, somehow this fact has been glossed over by several other narratives. For instance, when the entire Ranbaxy fiasco happened, and then the GVK Biosciences scandal a few years later, when a lot of people were asking this question about whether India has different quality standards compared to wealthier countries, basically, the answer given to many of us, including me as a journalist, was that no, there is absolutely no difference in quality standards. And then we would ask, so then why do these Indian companies keep getting pulled up by the FDA again and again? And we would be told that, oh, that's just a documentation issue, right? And they would say, oh, so this whole documentation, it's basically the FDA requires more documentation, and the documentation is just this superficial paperwork which doesn't really impact drug quality, whereas our CDSU doesn't really care about documentation, and therefore this whole issue of shredded paperwork and all is really no big deal, right? And the standards are absolutely the same. And it took me a while as a journalist to understand why this documentation is important and why it's actually central to drug quality. And I will tell you why. The reason is that when it comes to drug quality, you cannot ensure quality by just testing the end product, because the number of tests you have, quality tests, are extremely limited. So it's very important to make the manufacturing process, it's very important to keep the manufacturing process in tight control, because even minor variations will introduce new impurities and new problems which you simply cannot detect by end product testing, which is what happened in the case of nitrosamines, right? A Chinese firm basically changed its manufacturing process and did not report it to the regulator. And so that introduced large amounts of this carcinogenic toxin in the drug supply, which nobody detected for 7 years because the existing testing methods couldn't detect it.
Yeah.
So that basically tells you how little drug testing, how small the role of drug testing is in product quality, and how big the role of process integrity plays in product quality. And documentation is directly linked with process integrity, because documentation is how you ensure it, right? You basically, if you do something, you write it down so that it allows you to audit and verify later. So, you know, I digressed a little bit, but we would keep getting told that, oh, documentation is no big deal. And the other narrative which you keep hearing is that the stringent regulators have been sort of captured by big pharma, and they're deliberately introducing excessively stringent quality standards to keep the generics industry out of competition. Now, maybe there are instances of this, I don't know, but logically it does not make sense, because I don't see why even big pharma would deliberately impose an extremely stringent quality standard, because that is a cost for them too, and they're also focused on their bottom line. And so anyway, over time, you know, these are all the narratives that kept going around when the whole Ranbaxy thing happened, which ought to have been a reality check, but it wasn't a reality check for us here in India, because you had all these other narratives coming in the way. And in fact, I will say that I did report on the Ranbaxy issue, and I really did not understand what the big deal about was until I read Katherine Eban's Fortune article. So it was really eye-opening to me. So, because I was hearing all these other narratives. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make through all this is, until we actually acknowledge that we have different standards, and anybody who just does a little bit of research and Googling cannot deny that, because we have taken deliberate decision, and we have done that to improve access of medicine, which to a great extent is justifiable, right? We couldn't, as a poor country, you know, maybe immediately after independence or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, just jump to the quality standards of these countries which are so much more wealthier and have so much more capacity, because that would mean that we couldn't have gotten these life-saving drugs to a vast majority of people. But once we acknowledge that that's the trade-off we made, we are more in a better position to actually question if the basic premise behind that trade-off holds true. And that basic premise is that if we lower quality standards a little, and if we will get drugs to a lot more people, and that helps us meet our public health objectives. But is that really true? If you get a drug of questionable quality to 50,000 people, is that better than getting a drug of assured quality to, I don't know, 40,000 people, 30,000 people? That's the question we need to ask. You know, if you have a larger percentage of substandard drugs, are you able to tackle the burden of bacterial disease? Are you generating antimicrobial resistance? Are you able to tackle your burden of Helminthic disease? Or are you just sort of patting yourself on the back that, you know, you've increased access to medicine without really understanding the cost of it? So we need to start having that discussion, which is a far more nuanced discussion, which is that, is this deliberate decision to adopt different quality standards, has it served us well in terms of meeting our public health objectives? So, yeah.
Thanks very much, Priyanka, because that, I mean, you've said exactly what's been weighing on my mind. And, you know, I've been trying to think about how to frame the issue in this way, and you've done it so beautifully. So maybe if I could get Katherine to respond to what Priyanka just said, you know, about challenging this perception that, you know, lower quality, I mean, more stringent regulation is going to increase the economic costs of compliance and is therefore going to reduce access to medicine. What do you think about that argument as, you know, a barrier to regulatory change? And how should we think about, I mean, do we need to make this argument now in economic terms? Do we need to show what the economic costs of weaker regulation and the impact on human health is going to be in order to bring about the change that we want to see?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as I have been reporting on this issue, that there is an extraordinary cost, both hidden and evident, to noncompliance. So it is a business destroying thing for companies that don't comply. I mean, Ranbaxy basically doesn't exist anymore. And its settlement with the Justice Department in the US was the largest ever imposed on a generic drug company. You know, then there is the cost of low quality drugs in hospital readmissions and switched prescriptions, and a cost to human life. I think, you know, one of the problems for me as a journalist was, as I began reporting on this, those costs are really not assessed. You know, there were very few studies, especially when I started reporting on this issue in 2008, very few studies that even do a kind of comparative analysis of quality between brand and generic. And frankly, you know, when I started reporting on this back in 2008, the few studies that existed, and there was one done by a guy at Harvard, which said, we did this, you know, comprehensive study and found that the quality of generics is almost identical to the quality of the brand. And how did they do the study? By going to the FDA and getting the data that the companies submitted in order to get approved, right? And the point is, you know, we can't necessarily trust the data. Of course, the data shows that there's, you know, comparative quality because they're using that data in order to get approvals from the FDA. So there's this kind of, you know, there's this sort of confirmatory circle where people are able to just keep recycling the same talking points, and you can't really puncture that until you, frankly, as an investigative journalist, for me, I couldn't puncture it until I literally got inside of the C-suites of these corporations to find out the kinds of decisions they're making. One of the ways I was able to do that is through courageous whistleblowers like Dinesh. So, you know, there is an entire kind of hidden cost that almost never gets assessed. And we need a lot of candor about what that cost is. And frankly, we need way more studies than have been done. You know, the few studies that are done by people who actually understand this often emerge with, you know, really glaring findings about differential quality. And I see, I just want to point out, I see a note in the chat here about how do you put a price to quality of human life, taking the example of tacrolimus mentioned in Katherine's book. What is the cost of failed transplant? I mean, that is like, to me, the centerpiece of the cost argument is that you have patients who, in the US, we've had patients who have gone through heart transplants and then are switched to a you know, a generic version of an immunosuppressant that they need for life and suffer organ rejection. And we know that that's happened. You know, this is not to say that there are not scandals and fraud in the brand industry, but in my experience in over 20 years of covering the pharma industry is that fraud is often shows up much more in the sales and marketing ploys of the brand companies rather than in the laboratories. So, you know, I think we need real data to illustrate what's going on here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Katherine. And so if I could ask Mr. Sharma then to sort of respond to that and what are some of the things that the regulator in India could be doing to generate this kind of evidence? I mean, it's evident that there isn't the political will to do that, to do this kind of studies. I mean, to perform these kinds of studies. But what is it that, and what are some of the changes that you would like to see in terms of transparency? Because this is an issue now that's come up quite prominently in our discussion today.
Thank you, Dhvani. Before I respond to your specific question, I think one of the issues which I would like to clarify is about the law making. Dinesh had raised that point. So essentially, as of now, there is a committee which is headed by the Drug Controller General of India that's going to make some recommendations which will go to the government. After that, there are going to be interministerial consultations, and there will be consultations with the state also. Then the bill will go to the cabinet, and after, even before it goes to the cabinet, there will be a pre-legislative consultations. So pre-legislative consultation mandates, that is actually mandatory now, at least putting that in public domain for a period of 30 months and then waiting for the public to comment is mandatory. So the law has to necessarily go through the public consultations, and the process of public consultations has to be reversed in order to ensure that we are in a position to bring in whatever changes are required in the law. If this happens, I think we should be in a position to have a law which will be better than the best. But I am not too sure as of now whether the government will be in a position to do that fast. That is one issue which I thought needs clarification, and that is an opportunity for people working in the public health sector to make the best use of for improving it. As far as the quality aspects are concerned, I think I have a slightly different perspective. And my perspective is that even if there would have been a case for any leniency at any point of time in accommodating some quality compromises in order to improve access, no longer there is any requirement for any such leniency. So I don't want to comment on what has happened in the past or what has not happened in the past. But what I can say with firm conviction is that the capacity of the Indian industry today is such that they should be in a position to produce quality generic medicines, provided they are asked to do that and they are forced to do that also. Though that word might be a little tough to use. As far as those who are not in a position to conform to the quality requirements, I think I have only one suggestion, that is either they shape up or they ship out. There cannot be any compromise as far as the quality is concerned, and that is, I think, something which has to be apparent to anybody and everybody. Medical products are not something like other merchandise which we can use, and if there are quality compromises, we can throw them and things like that. They are impacting our body systems, mechanisms, and they are going to have lifelong impact also. In certain cases, as had happened in many cases in the past, they could be kind of fatal also. So having said that, I am of very firm view that no compromise in quality should be there at this point of time. And that takes me back to the first point, that this is the time for all people in who are in the know of things to contribute and ensure that while the consultations, either at the level of the ministries and departments and the state governments, or when there is public consultations, or when subsequently the bill goes to the standing committee, it should go, because I have not seen even one of the bills relating to drugs in the past being passed without discussion, even if those were not comprehensive, and even if they were only changing the kind of penalties for manufacturing in India. So that is what my perspective is. But as far as your specific question is concerned, I think there are a number of things that need to happen. So first thing I have been thinking for quite some time is that there has to be a convergence and collaboration in the inspections also. as Katherine also pointed out, the fear of the regulator is something which itself brings about a change. I have pointed it out in my book also, that inspections, even if they are not very stringent, if they are planned, if that planning itself makes some improvements to happen at the manufacturing units. So first thing I suggest is that there is a need for a more collaboration between the regulatory agencies across the globe. The system of joint inspections by the global authorities, the regulatory authorities, could be evolved. In case of USA, US FDA and CDSU, we have been trying some joint inspections during 2016-17 onwards. We have tried some, and sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't work. So that is one area where this can be done. Another is that perhaps these forms like PICs, they need to be made also little better. They need to be made little stringent also, and there also needs to be some inputs on the quality and not on the paper evaluation and paper kind of being used for establishing the equivalence. Then within the governmental structures in India, I am very confident, I am very sure that we cannot do with just the pharmaceutical specialists regulating all the medical products. There has to be a separate vertical for each one of them. Biologicals have to be dealt separately. Medical devices have to be dealt separately. And combination products, of course, you will require the expertise from different streams, because medtech is something which is now very, very pertinent in the healthcare administration. So there the products are more engineering in nature. So that is one thing which also is possible. Another possible area which should also be looked at is establishing some kind of organizations in the outside the government, who could look at who could be authorized to do certification, accreditation, inspections, and things like that. So those are the broad areas that I think could be helpful. So this is broadly what I think is possible to do. And in case of medical devices, there is already a discussion going on under the aegis of the Quality Council of India to have Indian certification of medical devices, ICMED scheme.
Right.
It has not moved too far, but I think if it happens, that will be also a kind of a addition to the regulatory landscape, and that will improve the regulation. Okay, I think
Great. Thanks very much, Mr. Sharma. I'm going to ask Dinesh to, talk a little bit more about some of the changes that you would like to see in the new drugs law that we hopefully have soon. So, I mean, Mr. Sharma has already pointed out some of the changes that he thinks will be beneficial in this regard. But one, it would be useful to hear from you what some of the challenges have been with the existing legal architecture, as in, if you can give us some examples of where the law has actually prevented regulatory action, that would be very useful. And, let us know what you think some of the key changes that you'd like to see in a new legislation for the country would look like.
Thanks, Dhvani. So actually, a month ago, because we knew that there was selective consultations that the committee was indulging in. We wrote up a petition and we sent it to the government, listing everything that we wanted to be considered in the law, and it's available on the web right now. But let me just pick a couple of things, and I'll just 2 or 3 of them to illustrate, how it's important, why it's important. Now, and Mr. Sharma will attest to this. The role of the Drugs Controller General of India today is 5 levels below the ministerial level. So there is a minister, then there's a secretary, then there's the Director General of Health Services. Underneath that is the CDSU, right? In order for the DCGI to even get on the agenda of the minister, you have to go through a long bureaucratic process, right? In India, we have statutory regulators outside of the ministry, right? We have the telephone regulator, TRAI. We have the banking regulator, SEBI. the reason why these are important is because they have a lot more ability to hire the kind of skill, the talent, to be able to be more responsive to people, right? There is absolutely no reason why we cannot have a drug regulator on par with these other regulators that we've seen in other industries, which function in a lot more responsive way to the public. You see SEBI responding when a financial issue is happening. We see TRI responding, right? We don't see DCGI responding because DCGI is so far down the bureaucracy of the system, right? That's number one. Number two is when we actually sort of wrote the law, we said that DCGI needed to be somebody with understanding of pharmaceutics. Pharmaceutics is essentially how drugs work. Go around the world and see what the skills the drug regulators are. Drug regulation is not about just pharmaceutics, it's about public health. We have to think about we have to put public health in the center. The position of the Drug Controller General of India, however you want to structure, right? Whether it is it's 5 different verticals, one essentially person overseeing all of these things, it doesn't matter. But that person has to have a public health background. Understand what evidence means, right? And so simple examples of this nature, right? The ability for the Drugs Controller General of India and the CDSCO to have the ability to hire talent, to be able to sort of get the right kind of skills available. Starting with the Drugs Controller General of India, get rid of the pharmaceutics background, bring in an MPH, right? Somebody who's got medicine background and public health background to be able to regulate this kind of stuff, right? That's number one. Number two is that we look at the way that we think about evidence, right? We treat evidence very differently when it comes to, Mr. Sharma talked about medical devices, what evidence means in that particular case, because they're a lot more complex than drugs in terms of engineering, right? But then look at Ayush. What is the clinical standard for approval of Ayush drugs? We have spent 30,000 crores over the last 10 years with the Ministry of Ayush, which is largely a marketing body, right? And people consume Ayush drugs, Ayush products, I wouldn't call them drugs, essentially on par with what is evidence-based medicine, right? We need to have a common evidence standard. You cannot put stuff on the label, and then claim all kinds of stuff that is not backed by clinical evidence, right? So you have to have a common understanding of what clinical evidence means, whether it's a medtech device, whether it's a drugs device, or whether it is a Ayush device, right? So these are the kind of things that we really have to think about, and look at, I think it's 17,000 crores, not 30,000 crores. I misspoke there, but what I'm saying is that these are the kind of things that we really have to think about when we are structuring the role of the regulator, the role of the regulation, and how we think about, evidence when we approve these drugs, right? I mean, like, for example, the US FDA, what it does, it creates a summary of an application that is submitted to for approval to it, taking out all the proprietary stuff and puts it out there, right? So that, somebody like me can look at it and say, okay, how did they evaluate the evidence, right? What is stopping CDSCO from doing that? You are evaluating the evidence, right? Put out a summary, 10-page document that says, okay, this is how we actually evaluated this evidence. This is how we inspected the manufacturing process. There is so complete opaqueness in the way that the CDSCO functions. So unless you have that level of transparency, you will not be able to have the trust that the regulator is doing what it's doing the right way, right? So, the petition, it's available on the web, and if you like, I'm happy to send it to whoever wants to. It goes through quite a level of detail of all of these things, highlighting the areas, saying, these are just areas, we're not being prescriptive. We're only highlighting areas that you really need to get the right stakeholders to come and advise you so that you can think about how to frame law in that particular case.
Absolutely. I think what you've said is echoed by someone in Dr. Vaidya in the chat as well about the need for not just a pharmaceutical approach to this kind of regulation, and that point is well taken. I'm also just going to weave in some of the audience questions now, because I'm aware that everyone, we should try and wrap this up in another 20 minutes. So I think one question from Kishore Dere is, I think, relevant to what we've just been discussing about the need for well-defined standards and, evidence against which we can approve and judge and assess drugs. So he asks, who is it who defines or decides the quality and standard of drugs or medicines at the international level, and whether this is an objective method, and whether it's necessary to have a uniform standard at all across the world if we take into account variations in geography and climate. So maybe Katherine and Dinesh, could I get the both of you to respond to that, if that's okay?
Yeah, Dinesh, you go ahead.
Yeah, so actually, you know what? Priyanka's been doing some work in this space. Let her speak, and then I'll speak right after that about harmonization.
Please. Yeah, Priyanka, if you'd like to jump in.
Yeah, so you can have uniform standards while also accounting for geographical and other differences, right? There's this body called ICH, which comes up which has guidelines for various pharmacopoeial tests like impurities, even GMP. So that is one forum for harmonization, where countries which are either members or observers can sort of immediately adopt the standards they are prescribing if they happen to be members. So who sets those standards? Right now you have various collaborative groups which are doing it. One of them is the Pharmacopoeial Discussion Group, which is a bit exclusive because the members are the US, Europe, and Japan. But there are also other harmonization initiatives across the world. For example, there are some initiatives in Asia. There are certain groups. I honestly don't remember the names. But I think one of the forums for harmonization, which is bringing quality standards of all countries to the same level, is ICH. I've been hearing a lot of criticisms of ICH, but by the way, one of the recommendations made by this high-powered committee to look into changes to a drug regulatory framework was that India join ICH. India has historically resisted ICH membership. In the first place, I don't even know if it's that easy to become a member, but in 2014 or so, there were news articles about patient access to medicine groups and the various industry bodies in India, including IDMA, not being completely on board with the idea of India joining ICH. So there was resistance because the belief was that if we harmonize ourselves with these more stringent regulatory agencies, it will kill our industry. And also the other argument which I made earlier, that their standards are deliberately stringent to sort of keep us out. But if you go by these recent news articles about this high-powered committee, then, and I've been talking to some industry bodies, they're actually today more open to the idea of joining ICH. But I don't think that's all there is. There are a lot of other hurdles and challenges. For example, what does India contribute to ICH if it becomes a part? Because these countries who are members of ICH have huge technical expertise and capacity to develop quality standards, whereas historically we have been borrowing quality standards from basically the British pharmacopoeia. So what are we going to do? So some of those are questions which have to be answered. I don't know if that answers the question, but...
No, that's very useful and informative, Priyanka. Yeah, Dinesh, you'd like to add something to that?
Yeah, no, so I think that what she said is exactly right. So when it comes to standards, right, within India for the medicines that we consume, right, we have a body called the Indian Pharmacopoeial Commission. That is what sets the standards for the quality of what we consume within our drug supply. Sadly, as what Priyanka said, it's a paper body. Okay, we have borrowed, all our methods, our monographs from either the British Pharmacopoeia or the US Pharmacopoeia. And unfortunately, if you look at, where the IP is today, it's years behind where, the other world pharmacopoeias are. The other part of the important aspect of the Indian Pharmacopoeia is it's not just setting the standards, but providing the physical standard itself against which you measure your formulation. So, for example, if you go buy a strip of crocin in the back, in the medical, in the medical shop there, right? If you turn it over, the blister pack says paracetamol, acetaminophen, 100 milligrams IP, right? IP stands for Indian Pharmacopoeia. And how do you know it's 100 milligrams? Because the manufacturer of that particular formulation actually tested that particular batch of the drug against the standard that IP provides. And that's how they say it's 100 milligrams, right? It's just like, how do you, when you go to buy vegetables, how do you know that, it's a kilogram, the weight is a kilogram, because there is some body that says, this is what a kilogram should weigh, right? So there's a body like that in India. Unfortunately, like everything else in India, this is underfunded, under capacity, and unfortunately doesn't help the industry maintain standards. It's part of the overall conversation we need to have. In our petition to the government, we've highlighted this issue because it's easy to complain about the fact that our standards are, excuse me, not where they are, but then you have to look at why they are not where they are, right? If you have these industry bodies that you're funding crores and crores of rupees every year, and they're not delivering what they're supposed to deliver, then you have to ask, is a body doing what's supposed to do? Should we fortify it or just get rid of it and follow international standard, right? There's no point in doing it in a half-assed way. And so this long and short of it is, it's an area that really needs attention.
Thanks, Dinesh. And I think we've discussed in quite a bit of detail the kinds of, the kind of law, the kinds of standards that we need. But another issue that I thought it would be useful for us to touch upon is also the enforcement and implementation. And again, we have someone in the chat who's spoken about this. So maybe if I could, Mr. Sharma, if you could talk a little bit about what some of the challenges with implementation have been, and apart, of course, from the fact that there are problems with the way in which the judicial process in the country functions, as well as the chronic understaffing of the CDSU. What are some of the legal loopholes in the act that prevent us from bringing violators to book in the way we should be?
Okay, Dhvani, I think before I answer this question, I'll take this issue which Dinesh has raised about the statutory drug regulator.
Sure.
He has raised a very pertinent point. In fact, I also feel that it is necessary to have a regulator who is independent in its day-to-day functioning, and that regulator has to be one for the nation as a whole. And there has to be one law for the nation, and that's what I stated earlier. And under the same division in the Ministry of Defense, there is another regulator, FSSAI. It has been given much more authority, much more power, and it's delivering also slightly better, only because it has been given a degree of autonomy and it has been invested with some level of authority. So I fully support that point that it has to be made fully statutory. Now coming to the other point about the standard also, I think I need to clarify that there are standards which are set up by the Pharmacopoeia Commission. Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission is there. It had been set up only in 2008 and it has grown up a little bit and it has done some work, but it needs substantial augmentation and improvement. In 2015-16, we had sanctioned a project for equipping it with a major laboratory. That physical infrastructure has come up, but perhaps it has not been operationalized as yet. And what has also happened is that there have been additions to the work of the Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission, but the manpower has not increased. In case of CDSU also, as you have rightly pointed it out, that CDSU is not the only authority for regulation of drugs in India. In fact, the authority of CDSU is restricted much to imports and external factors and clinical trials and new drug approvals. That is the broad area where they have the exclusive mandate. As far as the enforcement part is concerned, largely it is left to the state governments. Now, if you go to the state governments, in most of the regulators, you will find that they are working at a very low level of their strength. Sometimes it is the 30% of sanction strength, and at best it would be 60 to 70% of their sanction strength. Their laboratories where the drugs are tested are very, very rudimentary, and many times they do not have any apparatus available with them. In 2015, we had started a scheme for upgradation of the infrastructure. And we had given money to the states also. Some of the laboratories had also been re-equipped. And some new laboratories were also set up in the central sector. But some of them are still to become operational because manpower has not been sanctioned by the government. So while the physical infrastructure is there, equipment is still to come and manpower is not there. So that is one of the major handicaps. If you don't have the complete complement of all these things, the regulation cannot happen. The other reason is that the regulators in the states, they do whatever they want to do. They interpret the law, the manner they interpret, and that suits their state kind of perceptions. And in addition to that, there is no universal approach for even taking action. The degree of discretion that is vested in the inspectors is huge. And some of the inspectors have in the past used that for different purposes and with ulterior motives. I must clarify that. So that is another area I think which needs to be addressed. And then there is also a problem that all offenses have not been graded. You can't deal with the same, you can't put every offense in the same category. There has to be a gradation in terms of the gravity of the offense. So there are lots of issues, and in those cases, the discretion becomes a very important part. And there was no sharing of data. And it was only in 2016-17 that the process was started. Some degree of automation was introduced, and we had given the task to CDAC for coming up with a portal that's Sugam, and that was to be made convergent with the excellence system and things like that. But sharing is still restrictive, and it is not still happening. So within the absence of any information being shared, what happens is that if some transgressions have been noticed in one state, the other state doesn't know it, and even the central regulators don't know it. In many cases, even taking the cases to the courts, also there's a discretion for the state regulators. So there are lots of issues that need to be addressed, and all these issues need to be addressed in the law when it is enacted. And that is what I said earlier, that when the public consultations happen, there has to be a lot of things that have to be pointed out. Public health professionals and others, they need to point out what are the things and why they should be added and why some things should be deleted and things like that.
Yeah, and Priyanka and Dinesh have done some great work in pointing out exactly the discrepancies that you were just talking about, Mr. Sharma. Great. So knowing that we have to sort of try and wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to try and go through some of the questions that we've got from the audience. Katherine, I'll put some to you first because I know that you have to leave a little earlier. We have one from Shrikant Mangalam asking whether advanced countries can play a greater role in influencing change by placing conditions on export in much in the same way that they have done with other issues like child labor and environmental control. So would you have any thoughts on that?
Well, sure. So, what happens now is they have placed conditions on export, and it's GMP. I mean, it's compliance with GMP. So one of the reasonably powerful tools that the US FDA has and has used is something called an import alert, which if they come in and find that a drug company has not complied with regulations, then they will place the company on import alert, which restricts the export into the market. But the problem is that this has really sort of created a kind of cat and mouse game in which the US regulators are trying to function as sheriffs and detectives in India, where they don't really have any power under the law, under Indian law. They don't have subpoena power. They can't do search warrants, and then you have companies who are, as we found in the case of Ranbaxy, working on perfecting not their manufacturing, but working on perfecting their ability to conceal things from the US regulators, and got incredibly good at it. So how do we get out of that frame of just turning this into, a giant global game of Clue? How do we do that? One model that a lot of people do bring up is the airline industry, where there are global treaties that regulate compliance, and countries are signatories. So rather than having the US be sort of an underfunded, underpowered sheriff in a foreign land, you would have all the countries being signatories to a global treaty. And the questions about harmonization, it's very, very complicated. I don't even pretend to understand all of it. I'm not a policy maker, but there have been tremendous struggles over how to create something similar like that, and how you get everybody to agree to sort of universal standards of quality. And of course, I've heard many, many times, and I'm sure Priyanka has too, that the companies like to say, well, the standards are different from country to country. It's not that our standards are lower, it's just that they're different. So, how do we get to some sort of universal standard that has real teeth that all the countries of the world, or the major countries of the world, sign on to? I don't know. But clearly it's something that needs to happen.
Thanks, Katherine. We have another question from Dr. Anurag Jain on how the CDSCO goes about checking and interpreting the falsification of data provided by pharmaceutical companies. Mr. Sharma, would you like to take that one?
Yes. I before that, I'll like to clarify one point which Katherine has raised. I have written in my book, and I'm reiterating that, and I'm saying that with a sense of responsibility, that the inspections that have been carried out by US FDA and other foreign regulators in large companies in India, they have brought in a lot of change, lot of improvements in the internal structures and working and of the drug manufacturing units. And the improvement has been substantial, I must say that. I had been, during 2014 and 17, I had a monthly meeting with US FDA officials in Delhi. And also the drug regulator, drug controller general was present with his officials with me. So what we shared at that point of time was that this upgradation of the manufacturing practices in larger companies, in many larger companies, was at par with what is available in the Western countries. So a system of inspections, a system of joint inspections, which I was referring to earlier, perhaps is something which could be very effective. As far as the harmonization is concerned, I think a lot of efforts are already going on for that. In addition to ICH, PICS is another structure which is there. PICS is there, and for medical devices, Global Harmonization Task Force is there, which has also done a lot of work. So these things have been taken into account. Now, as far as the drug quality and its being substandards are concerned, there are 2 or 3 different approaches that are adopted generally. One is that the data which is collected by the CDSCO from the states, where there is still a lag because it is not still automated, it is not coming on still on the real-time basis. In those cases, generally, it is expected that in the meeting of the drug consultative committees, there will be a review of those kind of cases and the action taken by the state governments. But that also happens very rarely, and they have very less time also for discussing those issues. The second set of things is the statutory legal samples that are picked up by CDSU, where if there is any falsification, any shortcoming, CDSU is expected to take action on its own for prosecuting them in the court of law. And the third is that as you must be aware, and as I have written in detail in my book also, between 2014 and 2016, we had picked up 47,000 samples of drugs from across the country. And that has been done exclusively on randomized basis. And for that, complete design was developed by the Indian Statistical Institute, Hyderabad, and NIV was tasked with that responsibility. So after the survey results came out, the report was put in public domain. It's still available in public domain, and there are issues. On the basis of all the three inputs, the ministry had identified companies, and there was a format which was designed. Risk-based inspections were carried out. And that was an elaborate format in which the GMP requirements of the Indian law, WHO GMP, US requirements, European Union requirements, and even the PICS requirement had been put in, and that was used also for scaling the competencies of the manufacturing units. And those were also put in public domain in order to ensure that the companies themselves are in a position to have themselves assessed on their own also, with a view to bring about the changes. So these are some of the things that are that have been done, and they could have been replicated. However, risk-based inspections were subsequently stopped, and that perhaps was also to do with the availability of the manpower and things like that. But as I have pointed out earlier, as far as the internal within the country, I mean, when I say internally within the country, regulation is largely as on date entrusted to the state regulators. The role of the CDSU is minimal. It is the role for coordinating, and it is the role for a limited area. Okay.
No, Mr. Sharma, I was going to say goodbye to Katherine, who has to get going for another engagement. So just wanted to say thanks very much to her before we close this.
Thank you for having me, and really appreciate being a part of this terrific conversation, and to all the great questions that came in through the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Great. So, and thanks, Mr. Sharma. I'll maybe go through a couple of other questions that we have left, and then we can wrap this discussion up in the next 5 minutes. We have one, Priyanka. I don't know whether you might like to take this one, because I remember having talked to you about a story on this. Someone who would like you to shed a little more light on the issue of off-label and compassionate use of drugs, especially in the context of COVID-19, and perhaps what some of the legal and regulatory loopholes there are.
Yeah, I sort of have stronger opinions than a journalist should have on this issue. But India saw like a deluge of, well, off-label use. I think that would be, the example would be hydroxychloroquine, which was just, I think that was really badly done. It did not keep, it wasn't in keeping with our own guidelines for emergency use of emergency off-label use for drugs, and it wasn't in keeping with the WHO's guidelines. And there has been a substantial amount of work done in this area in terms of when an emergency occurs and when a drug shows promise, do you deploy it without sufficiently testing it, given that you have no other options? And I think it's obviously a very controversial question, but I think over time we have all realized that there is really no other way out then to actually test the drug by deploying clinical trials as soon as possible, which is what the recovery trial did, which is what Solidarity did. Why did they do that? Because they acknowledged the issue. They knew this was going to happen. And this happens in every emergency. COVID wasn't the first time. It happened in Ebola. There is always a lot of public pressure to quickly bring drugs. And so people are very vulnerable to the enticement of stuff like plasma therapy and hydroxychloroquine, etc. So I think India needs to take a more stringent view of the whole thing. And the next time such an emergency happens, we need to do clinical trials faster and gather evidence rather than just roll out these drugs without knowing. Because what happened with hydroxychloroquine? It doesn't work. So why did we give it to thousands and thousands of people? So yeah, that's all.
Great, thank you. Mr. Sharma, there's a very constitutional question here for you about having drugs and poisons in the concurrent list, which is leading to multiple state regulations. So the question is, why can't the union government pass an exhaustive code that makes it clear that it's occupying the legislative field as far as drugs go? And the analogy given is, that the Tobacco Boards Act does the same thing. So is this really about political will rather than about a problematic placement in the Constitution?
This is a very, very important question. So I'll answer it like this. As far as the constitutional placement is concerned, it's apparently in the concurrent list. So both state and the central government will be competent to enact laws and make rules, etc. of that. But having said that, under Article 252 of the Constitution of India, in respect of concurrent list, the central government is competent to enact the law. And if any state government enacts any law which is inconsistent with the provisions of the central law, that will be redundant. That will not be kind of legal. So to that extent, legally, constitutionally, the central government is competent to make a law for regulating the drugs in a manner it wants to. The problem, as I have been mentioning repeatedly, is more to do with the politics of it. See, India, despite being a union of states, I think has also grown as a federal polity, and federal polity has sometimes been more predominant than in other parts of the world also. In certain cases and in certain situations when different political dispensations are there in the center and the state. I think as of now, the state governments are very much clear that they don't want to cede any ground as far as the drug regulation is concerned, and they want it to remain under their control. And one of the reasons for this, which I could notice is, which Priyanka has also been speaking about, is that of setting up the industries in their particular states and things like that. But I think that's a wrong way of looking at things. If we decide once and for all that there cannot be any compromise as far as the quality of the drugs is concerned, and there has to be uniformity in the implementation of the law across the country, after that the competition will be in terms of providing facilities and things like that. And then if you want to attract industry, you provide better ecosystem within your state. That's the way to do it, and it's a question of political will, and if it can happen, that will be the best thing for the country to have happened.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Sharma. Dinesh, I'm going to address one last question to you from Shreya Srivastav, who's asked, in addition to this, the general consensus that there should be a centralized regulator, what are some of the other powers that this regulator should have that we don't currently see the CDSCO being able to exercise? So is there any power in particular that it should certainly be vested with? And are there any other non-negotiable accountability mechanisms that should find a place in the law?
Yeah. So, so we've already talked about the fact that if you have a independent regulator, your ability to hire skills have the kind of budget, those things will certainly matter. We already talked about transparency as well, right? Which is that you have to be more accountable, and the only way to do that is to try and make your work transparent. To Shreya's point, I think one of the things that we need enumerated within the law is what Mr. Sharma talked about, right? To us, when you have a hammer, right, everything else that you see, it looks like a nail to you. If the drug inspectors find an NSQ drug, they go to the court and try and prosecute, right? And 9 out of 10 times, those prosecutions are a joke. You get scot-free, or you pay 5,000 rupee fine even after killing so many people. So the point I'm trying to say is that the law needs to enumerate, levels of compliance. Like, for example, if you look at the US FDA, right? The first thing you get is an observation, the Form 483. Then you're given a time to essentially sort of address those issues that have been brought out to you. If you continue to do that same nonsense, you get a warning letter, right? A warning letter is a lot more stringent in the way there are real consequences to that, right? And if you still keep doing that, you get an import alert. And the import alert, basically, the companies comply because you can't, sell your product, right? The really, really bad ones get an application integrity policy, which is what happened in the Ranbaxy case. There is a gradation of how we think about this. And why it's important? Because when you go to the court, right? Even when you go to the court, what evidence are you producing? Typically, a judge is going to look at the evidence, right? We have never built a case file, right? The first violation, we essentially got somebody who's failed a product, essentially drag him to the court and say, hey, look, this person produced an NSQ drug. This is an example of how powers of the regulator need to be enumerated properly within the law. Because as Mr. Sharma said, if you give people discretion, right, they will use it in the way that they think is fit, which is the last thing we want, right? We want consistency. We want to also tell the industry that this is the way that we are going to behave, right? This is the way that a regulation is going to work. If you leave it up to the implementation of one DCGI versus another DCGI, the next guy who's going to come over, right, is going to be doing completely different things compared to what the current DCGI is doing, right? So to the extent that we want the kind of powers that this is just one example for Shreya's question. The point I'm trying to say is that we have a list of powers that we have written in the petition, but you have to enumerate them to the level of detail so that they work consistently across jurisdictions, across states in the country. And whenever there is litigation that you go to, there is actually some evidence, right? It's not just about one, report from a central drug lab or a state drug lab that basically says that product particularly. So these are the kind of things. And again, I come back to the same point that I made earlier, right? It is important that the civil society has a voice in framing this law. This discussion that we're having today is an important part of it, because what happens is that I don't know whether we have anybody from the government actually listening to what this discussion is, because I haven't seen one discussion so far on this law. One, this is the first one, right? Is that not important, right? So the thing is it's extremely important for us to have these discussions, because the lawmakers also need to hear this point of view, right? After hearing all of this, they may reframe it, right? They may go to Mr. Sharma and say, you know what, you were here. You were here for 5 years. You've seen how these things go. Come tell us, what do we need to do differently, right? Those things need to happen, and they're not happening right now. And I think that that's the most important thing. I don't think that we can prescribe solutions today. All we are doing is raising the issue that this is a really important issue for the country, and there are diverse voices and stakeholders that have their points of view. And please listen to us. Don't railroad the stuff when you make a law of this nature. That's all.
No, that's right. That's absolutely right. And I think that's the best note on which to end this discussion. It's been great to have this debate with people who care so passionately about this issue, and I can only hope that the powers to be are listening, or that we find a way to make them listen, just in the way as that Priyanka and Dinesh and Mr. Sharma have been doing. we sort of need to keep working on these issues and keep bringing them into the public consciousness so that people realize that this is a right to health issue, this is an access to health issue, and there isn't really anything more important than that at the moment. And if this isn't the time to drive that home, then I don't know what is. So thank you very much to our panelists for being a part of this discussion. I hope we can continue to have conversations like this. Thanks to all of you in the audience who participated with your comments and questions. Greatly appreciate it. And I'm sorry if we couldn't take some of them. I'm sure that some of the panelists here will be happy to be in touch with you about some specific queries that you might have had. And thanks also very much to Atul and Preeti for doing such a stellar job with the sign language interpretation. Hope everyone has a good evening, and I hope that we can continue to have many more conversations like this. Thanks very much and good night.
Thank you, Dhvani.